If you've been following the Barra Bedford build, you probably would have noticed this car sitting on the other hoist behind it. It's a bit of an unassuming old Liberty wagon, or Legacy if you're from anywhere else in the world but Australia. It belongs to a mate of ours, Ian, who's an airline pilot, so he hardly ever drives it, and normally when he does drive it, he's flogging the guts out of it and it blows up because it's a Subaru. But he loves it and he loves to spend a bit of money on it, so that's what we've been doing to it. So we're just going to have a look and we'll show you around. Let me take you to the Subaru life. If you're not familiar with the Subaru life, you probably would have never seen this. Possibly one of the greatest things about Subarus, but also required because you do have to take the engines out quite a bit, so it's pretty handy. Second thing you might notice about this engine is it's not turboed. We've removed the turbo and replaced it with a catch can because there's always stuff to catch. Intercooler's been replaced with an oil cooler. No, there's still a turbo on it. It's just not in the engine bay like they normally are. It's low mounted, which we'll have a look at in a second. A couple of other things to note. It's got one of these Cosworth cast manifolds on it. I don't know whether they make any difference to a standard one, but it looks fancy. Hypertune clamps, it's going to be running probably 35 pounds, something like that, so no silicon. GFB big blow valve for maximum noise. And it is now running a Haltech ECU. They do like a plug-in sort of, or not a plug-in, like a patch harness for these. So no more airflow meter. It previously did run the factory ECU making 350 kilowatts at the wheels, but yeah, getting to the limits of easy tuning at that rate. Airflow meters start running out, that sort of thing. So airflow meter is gone. It's got a 4-bar map sensor and just a GM air temperature sensor instead. Still drive-by-wire or run by the Elite. The rest of it's pretty straightforward, all Subaru stuff. It's just all pipes. They're everywhere. Don't ever buy a Subaru if you want to have a neat engine bay, because it can never happen. It doesn't matter what you do. If the engine runs, it will look like this. So let's have a look underneath. That's where all the fun is. Under here we've got coolant stains because it's a Subaru. We've also got a GTX 3584 RS turbo with a V-band 121 exhaust housing. So this is all mounted underneath for shortening the manifold. And I've been doing this on Subarus, on big powered ones anyway, for pretty much about the same time that Subaru released the Gen 5 Liberty Turbo, which has the turbo underneath the engine. So not my idea. I just copied off Subaru engineers. They know what they're doing, sort of. So this has had a low-mounted turbo on it for a long time. It previously had a 62 Precision on it, and before that it had a 6765, I think, which was a bit big. It had a manifold that I built years ago on it with a T3 flange. Was getting problems with expansion, gaskets blowing, just stuff that was really annoying, so that's why we've changed it to V-band. And I've also changed to slip jointed manifold, so it's actually a 2-piece manifold to allow expansion. These flat Subaru engines do grow quite a bit, so you've got to account for it, and it's really hard to do that with a thick wall like steam pipe manifold, because it's quite difficult to make slip joints for them. They end up being huge and bulky and have to be machined and that sort of thing. So these slip joints are very simple to make. I just use Old Cox exhaust bending machine, which has a sort of mandrels to make slip joints. They're very precise, slip them together. There's no leaks. You might get a little bit of E85 water coming out of them when they're cold, but there's no audible leaking sounds or anything like that. They're quite good and very cheap, and also that has still got a support function to it, whereas if you use like a bellow or a flex joint, it's not. So this has still got some strength in it with those flex joints in them, with the slip joints. That's why I use them rather than bellows. Bellows are very prone to failure as well. They're certainly not bulletproof. So the manifold's just made out of 304 stainless steel, nothing fancy, commonly available. It's been purge welded because that's what you pretty much have to do on thin wall stainless, otherwise it'll have problems with sugaring on the internals. Purge welding, I've also discovered, it makes a shit welder into a good one for a start because it's so much easier. It just uses a lot of gas, and gas costs money. Some countries like Australia, it costs a lot more obviously than it does in the States or in Europe, because we are pretty frugal with it because of the cost. So other things to note, it's got a turbo sump, of course, because it's well below the oil line. So we talked about this in the Bedford episode, but what this basically does is allow the turbo to drain oil into free air like it's meant to. It has a breather that goes up to the oil breather system, and then it has a scavenge pump that sucks the oil out of there after it's drained freely into it. So it has a small reservoir sort of capacity, and that's to allow for when the engine's switched off, oil will continue to drain out of it. It gives you sort of a bit of leeway, because if you just connect a pipe to the bottom of it, when the engine switches off and you get the residual oil pressure still coming through, it will end up drowning the turbo. I've been messing around with this stuff for years, and it is not easy, and it took a long time to figure out what works. So there's other ways to do it, but in my experience, this works. And guess what? I copied it off Subaru in their Gen 5. There's a reason why you do it that way, and that's because that's the way that works. So scavenge pumps up here, pumps back to the original oil drain. We've got a TL wastegate that's venting to atmosphere, or plumb back to atmosphere if you want to call it like that. It's got control over top and bottom ports. We've got a TCA4, which is a thermocouple probe in each cylinder that goes to a box that the Haltech then communicates with via CAN, so you know the exhaust temperature of each cylinder. Subaru engine making power, this is probably going to make 400 and something kilowatts at the wheels. You're pushing your luck so hard with these things. Yes, they can do it. This engine is worth a fortune, but if you get anything wrong, one cylinder is hotter than the others, that's when you're going to get problems. So with these thermocouples, you can measure each individual cylinder's exhaust temperature, which is an indication of its mixture and how much work it's doing, and you can adjust each injector for that cylinder to even them out if required. You don't know unless you put them in there, so they're a diagnostic tool basically. So the rest of the engine's just all the usual sleeves and all that crap that Subaru engines have to have in them to not blow into bits. As I said, very expensive. Cylinder heads are off a Spec C 2010 model. They're quad variable cam timing. Good heads, cost a fortune. It's got big cams in it, like 272 degree. The Haltech controls all 4 cams still, that it's all still constantly variable. Elite 2500 is perfectly capable of doing that. This vehicle actually originally was the first one to have that quad variable cam timing in the 2-litre engine. It came out with a 2-litre for a couple of years before they changed them to the 2.5-litre World engine, which is basically a shittier engine that's easier to produce, that still passes emissions, whereas the 2-litre wouldn't. So in Japan, they retain the 2-litre capacity because it's a much stronger engine, and generally they're a bit it's a bit nicer package but they do lack torque, and you do have to work them a little bit harder when they're 2 litre. So this car had the 2 litre engine in it. He flogged the guts out of it with a massive bolt-on turbo on it. It was the laggiest thing I've ever driven, other than a RB26 with a T88 on it. Ian doesn't care, he just drives it hard. It's just a toy. That made about 280 kilowatts at the wheels, which is way too much for a stock engine that's not meant to be a performance engine. Eventually it broke a rod bolt and everything flew to bits, as they do. Then it got a built bottom end, but it was a fairly basic unit, just a sort of a brand new EJ255 block with pistons and rods in it. That engine lasted ages. It was making about 350 kilowatt. It was a good thing. It was he was running it over the sort of rated power capacity that the engine builder suggested, and it eventually failed, as they do. So you might see a little bit of a clip of that in one of our previous videos where we're pulling the top out of an engine, and there's bits of rod and stuff floating around. I think we might even have a bit of it here. There we go. So everything fails sooner or later. He was pushing his luck. He knew it. He didn't care. He'd already bought this bottom end. It's been sitting here for ages waiting for it to blow up. So eventually it happened. So the rest of the driveline, 6-speed out of a 6-cylinder Liberty. Very easy to get in Australia, bolt straight in. It was originally a manual car, so there was no need to change cross members and stuff like the 5-speed autos require. I think the rear diff is just a pretty generic sort of R160 thing with a limited slip in it. It works all right. It's got Brembos on it, just off a STI late model one. Fuel system, it's got a big pump in the tank feeding this external surge tank here. Lots of hoses, speed flow everywhere, E85 running through it, heaps of noise. That's what they do. Plenty of fuel supply. Intercooler, we replaced the generic sort of like China intercooler, I suppose you'd call it, that was previously on it, with a Hypertune, 100mm thick, nice unit. Should do the job, no problems at all. That's the biggest one I could fit in there without taking the front bar and chucking it in the bin. They do make bigger ones, of course. As I said before, there's no silicone hoses or anything except for that. Everything's, all the pressure side is Wiggins style Hypertune clamps, because this will run at very high boost pressure as required to make power on a small engine like this. So we will send it off later today. It's heading back to Brisbane, and it's going to go get tuned somewhere. I don't know where yet. So hopefully it'll make decent power and not explode. But you can never guarantee it because it is a Subaru. So good luck. Thanks for watching.